Greetings everyone, we're going to do something a little differently. This is going to be a nighttime recording. Actually, I'm going to try to cut out my video entirely and just record some audio. Save YouTube's service the trouble. Turns out both my videos today got ditched by the YouTube. One of them didn't upload to my camera roll as I expected it to, so I accidentally deleted it while trying to export it to my camera roll. And the other one got corrupted. Probably had some of its data pitched when I ran out of room on my phone. Fun fact, the YouTube Capture app recording my rants will suck up 6 gigabytes of data in an hour and a half. I discovered this because I ran out of video while exercising today. But I had more exercise I needed to do, so I'm going to record a third and final video. This is going to be a video game review. I also did a political rant on welfare, but that was the video that got corrupted, so I'll have to do that again another time. Today we're going to discuss Final Fantasy. Let me get something out of the way. I know it's in vogue right now that when you do reviews, what people want you to do is create a character and provide entertainment in this disguise of a review. This is a very common tactic right now. See most of Channel Awesome, specifically the Nostalgia Critic, and the Angry Video Game Nerd. They're definitely reviewing the subject at hand without any care for they're also zero punctuation. They're all based on the same trope of the angry reviewer, and similar personas around doing reviews and making them an entertainment medium is very in vogue. I'm not going to do that. That requires a lot of planning and scripting, and that's not why I'm doing these videos. I'm not doing them to become popular. I'm doing them because I need to exercise, and it's best to do my exercise while spouting my mouth off. So you will not expect that any false reviewer persona from me, making either false praise or false anger to fit with that persona. If I'm being nitpicky, it's because honestly I want to be nitpicky with that game. Now, today I'm going to do Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy XIII. I wish I was doing Final Fantasy III. That is Final Fantasy VI in the real numbering. It was released as Final Fantasy III here in the US. But we can't... that one I'll save for another day. It's just me heaping praise on it for a half hour. It's not exactly an entertaining review, and not exactly topical either. So I'm going to do Final Fantasy XIII because this is still relatively topical. Recently I listened to a review done by JesuOtaku of Channel Awesome, and she was the first one I ever heard explain why Final Fantasy XIII isn't really a Final Fantasy game, and what makes it actually a bad game in general. She got very detailed, very granular in her analysis, and I enjoyed it. But I also mildly enjoyed Final Fantasy XIII, so I felt the need to provide my own commentary and hopefully get people to think, to really think about the game itself, rather than think about it emotionally. For those reviewer friends I have, I'm not trying to take your spots. You know who you are. If you ever see these videos, totally not trying to take your spot in the reviewer world. You guys are far better than me in general. Again, I'm just trying to spout my mouth off. So, Final Fantasy XIII. This was the first Final Fantasy game to release for the, I think it was the 7th generation of consoles, the PS3 and Microsoft Xbox 360. This was the first Final Fantasy game that I know of to have gotten a dual console release, and was the first Final Fantasy game not to have the original producer and primary composer, two different people, that were common in the game, that were a common thread throughout Final Fantasy's career. This, of course, is accepting the Final Fantasy games, which were actually not Final Fantasy games. We had a bunch of games in the Final Fantasy series that were released with the Final Fantasy name here in America, but were actually different games in Japan, but Square decided they couldn't sell it without the Final Fantasy name. Notably, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest on the Super Nintendo, and Final Fantasy Adventures on the Game Boy. The Game Boy ones were actually Game Boy versions of the Saga series, if you're familiar with Saga Frontier. So, Final Fantasy XIII was a lot of firsts for the series, and was not well liked by the general users of Final Fantasy XIII. Let's kind of go down the numbers. Plot. I didn't like the plot of the game. It really fell flat. People will tell you the story sucked, and I have to agree with them. There's a very solid reason for that. And if you are having to watch this video, I very much apologize. I'm totally just showing you my ears so you can, because it's easier to hold my phone that way. So this is the plot is basically one insanely long and complicated Batman gambit. For the Star Wars inclined, Admiral Thrawn gambit. What does that mean? That is the Batman Gambit is the official TV tropes title for a complicated plan that relies on perfect knowledge of what your adversary will do. Basically, how your adversary will react. You're not reacting to anything your opponent does. Everything your opponent did is exactly according to plan. Batman is well known for these. Admiral Thrawn was well known for these, and that is the story. Is everything you do in that story is one long Batman gambit until the final boss fight. And apparently, the one thing he didn't expect is that when he revealed that everything you did was exactly according to plan, you'd be angry and attack him. I don't know how he didn't account for that one. It's almost Xanatos Gambit, because it appears that at times you're going you're going opposite to his wishes, and it still falls into his plan. Again, look it up on TV tropes. But the fact that that's the whole setup for the game, and that's really the entirety of the plot, is, it's a long con entirely designed to prevent the action, to complete the bad guy's goal, and you do it for him. And there are games that have done this in the past. System Shock and BioShock both had instances where part of what you do through the game is actually what the bad guy wants. I'm sorry if you have not played BioShock or System Shock 2. You might be able to figure out the plot from that, but I tried to keep that as vague as possible. The plot really, but the difference here is that you really have no feeling of agency. There's never a time where the game reveals this to you and then gives you back and then allows you to and then gives you back your agency. This is especially egregious in a role-playing game because you want to feel like what you're doing matters. You're already in a situation where all you're doing is grinding for numbers in some cases. And the idea that in the end, you're grinding for numbers to help the bad guy win really, really hurts your investment in the plot. And the fact that it ends up being all solved through, Deus Ex Machina. Something happens, God intervenes, world is saved. Woo! I mean, there's no feeling that any action you committed as a character had any effect on this game world at all. It's like the feeling I got at the end of Mass Effect 3, where all these choices, this long list of choices I'd made over 3 games, were instantly punted out the window. I mean, they had some minor effects, but in general, they punted out everything I'd done, and it all came down to one single decision, A, B, or C, with the only agency you had in that is you got option C if you did enough work. If you did the bare minimum, you only get option A or B. If you do enough work, you get option C. And you feel the concept of, for a series that was so selling itself on player agency, the idea that you just completely lost it at the end and nothing mattered. Is how you feel at the end of Final Fantasy 13. That just nothing you did mattered. It was a completely worthless venture, and that didn't sit well with me. So I was a little unfulfilled, and then I found out that this was the first Final Fantasy game that included an end game. Previously, any work you want, I kind of knew before the final boss fight, due to having looked a few things up. I did actually know that before the final boss fight, but I was quite a distance in before I found that out. Probably 80 to 90% of the way through the game. And what bothers me about that is, in a Final Fantasy game, normally, there's a point of no return. Final save point, generally a distance from the final boss, and your entire game is a design. And if you want to do anything, completionist in that Final Fantasy game, you have to complete it before you keep going. Sometimes you can even get up all the way up to the final boss and pull all the way back to that old save point. So it's not a true point of no return. But even with it, even then, in fact, in most of them, it's not a true point of no return, as they appear in some games. But even then, it's still, this is your last spot. Do all your grinding. Go back and finish any optionals you want to finish. This is it. Final Fantasy VII, I'll use that as a good example, because there's a nice clear one. There's that one platform halfway through the dungeon that has a save point, that save point is your final stop. And then if you're moving on, it's generally because you're going to go take on Sephiroth. If you want to fight the weapons, you have to fight it before. There is no... Final Fantasy is notable for not, in general, having New Game Pluses, so there's no clear data. But Final Fantasy XIII, on the other hand, you beat the boss, and the game doesn't end. Now, you're... In Final Fantasy XIII, I believe after beating the boss, you're given a save clear. And then you have the option of going to like 3 different locations and doing the end game, which is building up towards some big optionals, specifically Adamantoise farming, finishing off your Crystarium, all of building the ultimate weapons, all of that you have to do. Is kind of expected that you do it in the post game, and that struck me as a little odd. The idea that I'm expected to beat the final boss in such a story-heavy game, I'm expected to beat the final boss, go do other stuff, and then maybe come back and fight the boss again. Having improved, and achievements were a big. This is the first Final Fantasy game with the concept of achievements, or trophies on the PS3. And those trophies, for an obsessive completionist like me, are just, I have to get, I feel like I have to get them. And the idea that most of them, are things that are hundreds of hours after you've beaten the game, that's when you collect them. That was a really, really strange concept to me. I'd seen games with an end game like this, but never to the scale Final Fantasy XIII had it. Massive departure from convention. And as much as Final Fantasy likes to mix it up game to game, such a massive departure from the structured conventions that Final Fantasy was known for, was certainly a hard sell, and so that didn't go over too well for me. Move on from plot to characters. Vanille was my favorite character, but despite Vanille being my favorite character, it was not. She's not universally liked. I think the reason I like Vanille is, as she starts out as a happy, bubbly character with this kind of a hint that maybe there's something underneath there, and you start to realize over time that she's very torn and conflicted and over her failures in the past. I know one person who hates her specifically because at the end it's revealed that she could kind of be considered the cause of all the problems in Final Fantasy XIII. But I thought her characterization was very, very real, and the anxiety she faced is something I'm familiar with. I have general anxiety disorder myself, so that was I did like her. On the other hand, most of the characters were pretty bland for me. Snow, I kind of liked, but his major, what really felt like it should have been the major plot arc for me, was the realization of how his actions as a freedom fighter / terrorist were harming people in the form of the constantly present what's his name? Hope. Hope, whose mother was killed because of snow. I thought that should have received a lot more attention than it did. As it was, it caused Hope's character, because of the lack of this character story, really fell flat for me. He felt like he didn't have much of a point to the story. I guess, he's supposed to be somewhat of a joke, a kid with no hope being named Hope. I don't know. I didn't like him. Most of the other characters kind of fell flat. Saz was supposed to be really cool, but, in general, I didn't enjoy him. Lightning was there, and she seemed really exciting in the beginning, and then just became a one-note character as the game rolled on. And Fang, I just didn't care about. So, in general, the cast for the most part fell flat for me. I didn't like them. Most of them just didn't have very deep story arcs. And they only had 6 characters to work with. Contrast this with Final Fantasy VI, which had a cast of 12 or 16 characters. I can't remember how many bonus characters there are. But it was like 4 or 16 characters. And 12 or 16 characters, not 4 or 16. It's like 12 or 16 characters. And most of them, I felt a lot stronger connections for. I felt more invested in tracking them down in the second half of the game and re-recruiting them into my party. Potential spoiler for those of you who have not played Final Fantasy VI. I'll let you skip the video forward about a minute. Final Fantasy VI, well, it is my favorite Final Fantasy game ever. And the reason is that halfway through the game, the villain wins. Halfway through the game, probably 30 hours in, I thought I was looking at the end game. And then I discovered, no, that was just the halfway point. Games keep still going. I was thinking it was kind of short, but it kind of felt short, and then I realized that I was only at the halfway point. Very, very great game. And the characters are just all wonderful, and some of them are pretty flat. Mog is a very flat character. The secret characters Umaru and Go-Go, clearly very flat. They didn't have much to them. But in general, the characters had every character had a story, and you had to resolve, and an optional quest was to resolve that story to one degree or another, which was very, very nice. I highly enjoyed it. And so to see such a long game with 6 characters that, you know, Saz has a nice arc, I'll admit. But he has at least this good motivation. But the idea that all these characters are just so one-dimensional in general, they generally don't develop over the series, that's just so painful to me. A lot's been said about the linearity of this game. So I'm going to tell you, any previous Final Fantasy game, any RPG on the Super Nintendo, and PlayStation era, and probably even in the PS2 era for the most part, they're pretty linear games. I'm sure there are some exceptions, but Final Fantasy, a lot of people have said that, you know, they're known for having these open worlds, and this game is 90% one-way streets. No branches. Beginning to end. Yeah. That is all true. But all that means is they're not hiding the linearity of the game. I'm going to list Final Fantasy VII again because it's an easy example that a lot of people have experience with. Think about it. How many times did you walk into an area that you weren't supposed to be in yet? I'm gonna bet the answer is 0. You get plenty of mobility, but not many ways not many places to go with that mobility, until you get the airship, and by the time you get to the airship, you've been just about around the entire planet. It's a very linear game that is disguised as an open world. There are just all these bottlenecks that you have to travel through, and you're not going to progress at all, or progress any side missions until you're not going to encounter any side missions until you progress these things. Now, admittedly, Final Fantasy XIII was even more restrictive. The only open area it had was Grand Pulse, and in general, Grand Pulse is is a lot more limited than it seems at first. It just seems pretty big because you're used to these one-way roads. So the game is more linear, but not by much. I wasn't too bothered by the linearity. Would I have liked some hints towards the idea that this world is a little more open than a single corridor? Sure. Would have been nice. But not critical. Sound. JesuOtaku noted that there are 3 music pieces. The victory theme, a tune actually called Final Fantasy, and one other which I can't remember, that have been in all previous Final Fantasy games. Again, excluding the ones that were weren't actually Final Fantasy games in Japan. I don't find their absence as horrible as some people do. JesuOtaku is very passionate about their absence. I find their absence difficult. Well, not even difficult. Find their absence lamentable. I don't much care about the victory theme. I think I don't. In fact, in general, I've gotten a little sick of it. So it's missing. It being missing isn't much of a problem for me. But overall, the sound is very bland. They went with some generic pop covers instead of the custom songs that the Japanese have, because it was too much money to rewrite the Japanese songs, but apparently it was totally worth it to change the wordings on the few songs that were in English in the Japanese version. They were songs with English lyrics, and those got recorded with slightly less broken English, which generally isn't much of a problem in a song anyway. But that's what they prioritized, and I don't understand that. The music is just bland. I don't. Final Fantasy VI, I totally want to track down copies of the of all the three soundtrack versions that existed for that game. But on the other hand, I don't want to. I wouldn't do that for Final Fantasy XIII. There's nothing that came out and grabbed me. Finally, we have to get to the combat system. Now, I want to step out and talk about a movement that's been happening in a lot of indie RPGs I've played in the last decade. Primarily, the best example is the ones by Zeboyd Games. Those would be the creators of Penny Arcade 3 and 4, Cthulhu Saves the World, and Breath of Death 7. These are 16-bit homage RPGs, but their combat system does away with long-term resource management. The puzzle in the Final Fantasy games to this point has been managing your resources such that when you reach the boss, you have full HP, most of your MP, and a good stock of potions and others, so you can fight, and you're having to manage these resources through the entire dungeon. These indie RPGs switched it up and said, let's do away with long-term resource management. Let's change the puzzle that is fighting to, rather than being one of resource conservation, being one of all out, you have to use all the resources you have, because using all the resources you have is how you are going to progress. And the traditional Final Fantasy favors a conservative style of play. Very, in the early game, very tedious, very long-winded, trying to, have the least amount of, take the least amount of damage possible, because you're having to conserve all those resources. Whereas this new style favors aggressive gameplay, trying to figure out ways to dispatch enemies faster, with better effectiveness than you did in Final Fantasy games. I actually like this new system, this concept, and Final Fantasy 13 took a crack at it. So I don't have a problem with doing away with MP and HP only being a being a resource that refills each combat. It definitely favors the combat style, the aggressive combat style. But then they completely undo that by they completely undo everything they did to try to push in a more aggressive style with the way they built the paradigm system. Now, a lot of people dislike the paradigm system because it's very, very much removes your agency. 12 took a lot of, 12, you had a lot of agency in how your characters acted because you had to build the gambits. You had to figure out what worked. If the game played itself, it's because you were doing it right. If you were struggling to play the game, then if you were struggling in areas, either your gambits were wrong or you weren't encountering an edge case. And if you were encountering an edge case, then very clearly all you had to do was take active control of your character. It's a situation that the gambits couldn't account for, and you dealt with it manually. Very reasonable, very easy to deal with. Contrast with 13. The only agency you have in 13 is setting up which paradigms you have available and then setting which paradigm is active. Now, this is a very strong reduction in agency, and I'm not going to say it isn't. But to the concept of the puzzle, combat as a puzzle, I found it was enjoyable. But combat as a puzzle, while enjoyable, it had some very fatal flaws. Specifically, I like to be able to have, the paradigm system seems to be set up that you take your puzzle pieces, your paradigms, and you put them on the board in a specific order. And if you do it right, you are rewarded with winning. You put them on the board in a certain order, and you're rewarded with a win. The problem is rather than have the string of really awesome combinations to fit any situation, you're limited to 6 puzzle pieces. And that means there's a whole lot more edge cases that can't be dealt with by a paradigm you have pre-prepared. And because of that, you're stuck a lot more often jumping between paradigms, just praying that you'll be able to survive. And that's less fun. So, I didn't like... The combat system was entertaining enough, but it's not something I want to go through again. And it is one of the many reasons I won't be trying to revisit Final Fantasy XIII to finish off its trophies, because I'm going to have to run through the whole game again, and that was just a chore. And that's really what it comes down to. Final Fantasy XIII at times feels like a chore. Enemies are given staggering amounts of health, which means even the simplest fights can take excess of 5 minutes, and that's just a problem. You want a snappy, speedy system if you're trying to favor an aggressive style of gameplay. But the decisions they made slowed down the system after making choices deliberately designed to speed combat up. The new lack of long-term resources only works well when there isn't a resource or when you want to speed combat up. You don't want to make regular combats drudgery. If you're making regular combats long, drawn-out experiences, you're doing aggressive style fights wrong. And that's really why I didn't like that's really why the combat system over time came to be something I disliked. I enjoyed it at first, but the longer and longer it went on, it was just not enjoyable. And that kind of comes to the final problem, and that's that the game itself starts out very, very entertaining, but very quickly, after you get through the obligatory string of opening videos, it just slogs down into a chore. It's not useful at all. It's not fun. So, in conclusion, Final Fantasy XIII really, if you listen to developer commentaries on it, you find out that what they did is they built this great framework, combat system, all this stuff, and then, after building this great framework, said, what are we doing? We actually need a game, we need a plot, we need characters, we need all of this stuff. And none of that was being thought about until a year into development. And it's a real shame. It's very clear the new developer didn't know where he was going with it. The new music director, he was actually decent, but the English localization cut out a lot of his work. And so you lost even more. So, he didn't seem to be like doing a good job, unlike the previous Final Fantasy music director. And so you definitely have lost something in the translation to this new management team inexperienced in Final Fantasy. And trying to put a game with such gravitas behind it. That name, Final Fantasy, has such power, and we expect a high-quality game, and it really did not come through for Final Fantasy XIII. I actually, for a long time, was making the move to play Final Fantasy XIII 2, but I lost my save, and I've tried going back and playing it, but my heart isn't in it like it was then. I think with Final Fantasy XIII 2, I was really running on the hope that it was producing a somewhat better story, but it's the same core framework of Final Fantasy XIII that I was starting to burn out on, and I was running on story, and now that I have to run through that story again, I'm not getting into it. So, yeah, it's a real shame. I'm hoping Final Fantasy 15 is going to be better, but Final Fantasy in general has been good about creating strong female characters. Cells, Tifa, Ares was even very independent. Quistis, Renoa, Riku, Yuna, they're all independent and relatively in control of themselves, able to make their own choices. That was very good. So, it's a bit more progressive than you generally see. It's definitely got some problems with the wardrobe in some cases, but definitely a strong decision by the Final Fantasy executive teams in the past. Lightning even, despite as much as she fell flat, was very much a strong independent character. And I'm hearing that Final Fantasy 15, they're just like, yeah, we want to appeal to the male crowd, so we're not going to put any women in the game, in your party. And it just was like, what? I don't know how to respond to that. I'm going to have to see. I'm gonna reserve judgment till I play the game, but it's not looking good. It doesn't sound like... Yeah, everything I'm hearing about Final Fantasy 15 still sounds like they don't know what they're doing. They're able to build a framework, but they really don't know... You know, they can build the skeleton of a building, but they don't know what type of building they're trying to build. I still don't think they know that. So, yeah. So I'm going to be doing video game reviews and movie reviews every so often. Again, as a part of my exercise. So comment on what you want to see, what you want to hear from me about. I'm going to be trying to just do straight audio reviews, because really pointing a video at my face for 40 minutes, who wants to see my ugly mug for 40 minutes? So I will talk to you all later.